We're now going to talk about the ways that human beings have increased propulsion, and we're going to start with a short history. Really, people analyzing how swimmers move through the water started back in the late 1890s and early 1900s, and didn't change much right up through the early 50s and in the middle 50s. And really, everyone's thoughts up to over those 50-year period of time was that Mr. Newton was correct, and if you wanted to go forward, you pushed back in the water, and you had action-reaction. Probably the first great coach scientist in the history of our sport was Doc Councilman. Started at Cortland State University in upstate New York, and then moved to Indiana University, which is where he was for the vast majority of his career. He was the coach of the 1976 Olympic team, which won all but one gold medal in Montreal. Tremendous coach, and also a very well-respected scientist in his own right. And Doc came up with various things as he studied swimming. He started with simply graph paper imposed on the side of his pool underwater in a giant graph where he could study swimmers' movements and see what they looked like. And one of the first things that Doc came out with in the late 50s, early 60s, and talked about through the middle 60s, was the idea of swimmers moving their hands through the water in a search for new water. So to get effective propulsion, they were trying to touch water that was not already moving. So they were looking for new water or still water. 8 or 9 years later, Doc came back after doing a great deal of work in all four strokes and filming a large number of his Indiana University swimmers who were some of the best swimmers in the world at that time. And Doc came back and said, you know, most of the pulls that we see are in the S pattern, and there would be an in sweep, an out sweep, and there would also be an up sweep and a down sweep. Doc called them the S pattern, and the S pull became one of the things that coaches latched onto very strongly when they're looking for effective pulling patterns in their swimmers. And if you look at strokes of those of that era on film, you'll see that S pattern very clearly. It was what coaches taught. Once Doc taught us, that was the way to go. About 10 years later, in the early 70s, Doc came back to us again at an ASCA World Clinic and said, guys, I think I have this all wrong. I think most of swimming propulsion comes from a thing called lift. And he described Mr. Bernoulli and Mr. Bernoulli's principles of lift. And, of course, it started with airplanes and airplane wings. And we'll go into that some more in some detail later on. But Doc had radically changed his mind. And many coaches who were wedded to the idea of the S-pull and a little bit wedded to Mr. Newton kind of didn't accept all this new idea very readily. But of course, many of the younger coaches latched onto it and said, aha, we've got a new way to look at stroke, a new way to teach stroke. And in fact, lifts explain some of the things that were hard to explain with the drag theory or the action-reaction theory from Mr. Newton. So it didn't explain everything, but explained a lot of things. And for many years, coaches latched on to lift as the way to go. Following in the line of coach scientists, Coach Ernie McGlisco, talked about the same movements, and he described them as sweeps, and he talked about up sweeps and down sweeps and in sweeps and out sweeps in all four strokes, and did a marvelous job of educating us about a little bit better how to talk to athletes in a more meaningful way rather than talking about lift and drag in terms of what our hands should be doing in the water. All of those things didn't explain certain types of things. For example, a butterfly kick. And so Cecil Colwyn, who was a well-known coach from South Africa originally, had coached some in Australia and spent the majority of his career in Canada, talked about circulation around a vortex. And we'll shortly be looking at some things that indicates a different form of lift where you create circulation based on a cylinder moving through water, which of course resembles our arms and our legs a lot more than an airplane wing does. There has been a constant battle over the years between both scientists and coaches talking about lift and drag and lift versus drag and what creates propulsion. And as we're about to describe to you, modern thinking says that both of these play a role in most forms of the strokes. Some simple things when talking about propulsion. Number one, the Newtonian position is when you swim, you put your hand in the water and you pull yourself beyond that point. I think most modern analysis of stroke technique would say that that's absolutely accurate. We want to anchor well in the water and we want to pull ourselves past it. And if you use your lane lines and your eyeballs and you watch a swimmer on your team put their hand in the water, the majority of them will come out pretty close to the same place. A few of them, who tend to be the better swimmers, will have their hand come out ahead of where it went in. And a few who tend to be your less skilled swimmers will be people whose hand will slip through the water and actually move slightly backwards relative to the lane line. And you can do just that simple look to see who has some real feel for the water and who perhaps is slipping and sliding a little bit as they try and pull. So again, we've got two basic forces and ways that we anchor that hand. One is drag and one is lift. And of course, drag is a topic that really is sometimes confusing because there is drag that is negative to swimmers' propulsion. That's created by a number of things, basically starting with their body position in the water and their water resistance to the body. But scientists also use the term drag as drag propulsion, which is when you're grabbing a handful of water. So it is a little bit confusing, but when we're talking about propulsion, we are talking about both lift and drag as two of the primary means to move yourself forward. So let's talk about drag a little bit. It's limited, and you need to kind of understand what the factors are that limit drag propulsion. Number one is choosing your parents wisely. And if you choose your parents wisely and you're a swimmer, you have big hands, you have big feet, you have long limbs, and you have good proportioned limbs so that you can get a great paddle from your elbow to your fingertips on the water. So that's one feature, certainly. You also choose your parents carefully because they are people with a significant number of fast-twitch muscle fibers so that you can accelerate the hand through the water. And then the third thing, and this is neither one of those obviously are coachable, that's just picking your parents correctly. But what we can coach about increasing drag is the pattern that the hand and the forearm and the arm and the upper arm moves through the water, and we can coach the pattern of movement, and that's the thing that we focus on when we're trying to increase our drag propulsion in the water. Where does the hand and where does the arm move? And that's what we spend time teaching to young people. There are other things that influence how well we use drag. Certainly our resistance or the lack of resistance in the water is a big one of those things. Our explosiveness as a musculature explosiveness is another one of those features, and both of those are fairly critical. Strength is the ability to generate force, and generating force means one time how quickly can you move your limbs against resistance. And as many coaches fully recognize, the ability to accelerate your hand from the beginning of the stroke to the back of the stroke, very, very important in creating good stroke technique. Limb proportions and their relationships are also very important because basically when you change the levers and change the directions of the force on the water, that's one of the things that helps us either be very skilled in the water or will result in us not being very skilled. So the levers and how they are affected by limb proportion is important also. And then, of course, it's not just enough to know where the arms are supposed to move, but you've got to be able to teach it well. So the teaching of good biomechanics is another important piece. This particular photo is an old-style photo from one of Doc Councilman's original books, and we put it in here for the historical perspective of it. I'm speaking of the drawing on the lower left-hand part of the screen. And you will note that there is a difference in hand pitch, and the hand pitch changes as we go through the stroke. And you also see the old-style head position with the eyeballs looking forward and the water hitting about at the hairline. So let's move that head down for a modern stroke. But one of the things that still sticks is that first arm position on the right side of that screen is a good arm position. You've got the elbow up, you've got the fingers pointing down, and you'll notice that there are slight changes of hand position as we look at it. So you can also look on the right side and you can see the relative position, hand position in the water versus maximum propulsion at different stroke angles. For you, those of you who are scientists, you'll see the top graph with drag coefficient versus angle of attack. And while there are differences in the angle of attack, they are not huge differences, and it's going to be a matter of your angle of attack being determined by what feels right to that particular athlete in the water and what seems to move them forward most efficiently. Again, the lane line test of looking at where the hand goes in and where the hand goes out is probably the on-deck coach's best possible way to say which way should the hand be pitched. One of the questions that we get occasionally more from parents than we do from young coaches, but should the hand be finger spread or should it be locked rigidly together? And I think most coaches will say, after looking at video, that a slight separation of the fingers seems to be slightly advantageous, and you'll certainly see a slight separation of the thumb from the hand in most swimmer strokes, and that may be one of those things that everyone feels in the water, but it's undescribable what the scientific principle behind that might be. As we said, this is a simple representation. You notice the swimmer is flat on their stomach, their eyeballs are looking forward, the water's at the hairline, and that second position, the middle position of the arm, today would be considered a stroke flaw. We'd want to have that elbow more forward so it looks more like that first position on the swimmer, and of course you're going to see that swimmer rotate. One of the things that we talk about today is keeping the armpit open, and you can compare that concept with this particular drawing, which obviously is not demonstrating that. But today we talk about keep the armpit open as long as we possibly can. We're going to talk now about lift, and there are several different mechanisms that create lift, but lift is simply a difference in pressure above or below the wing shape. Wherever we have a flat or bottom of the wing shape, we're going to have more pressure than we are where we have air or water, in this case, on the side of the curved surface. So there's a relative difference between the curved surface and the surface that is flat, or the bottom side of the wing. The wing tends to move into the space with the lower pressure, or the back of the hand, right, or the curved surface. And the lift force is going to occur at a 90-degree angle to the flow of the wing. So the wing and how that wing shifts in motion does matter, and we're going to see that very specifically when we start looking at breaststroke pulls. And that is known as the angle of attack. How does the edge of the wing attack the water as it comes through the water? Using the old illustration of an airplane wing here, you'll see the higher pressure on the flat surface of the wing. You'll see the lower relative pressure as the air molecules move across the top of the wing, so that the wing is pulled into the relative vacuum and the airplane lifts. So you'll see the lift at a 90-degree angle to the flow of air across the wing, or water across the arm and hand in swimming. Right? And you'll see that there is a drag force going straight back along the lines of the aircraft. Ancient representation of lift, but accurate to some degree today, except the human body has no shape that looks exactly like an airplane wing, so there are some relative differences here. Because we're not fish or birds or airplanes, we have a different shape in the water and the shape of what attacks the water as we move through it. And Barry Bixler, one of the great scientists of the last 30 years, passed away a few years ago. And Barry basically said all bets are off, meaning that when we look at arms moving through the water and hands moving through the water, there is a boundary layer separation between the hand, the actual hard surface, and the water. And it slightly changes all the equations that have to do with lift. So those of you who are significant scientists will understand what that means, and the rest of us will know that there are differences between pure lift that we might demonstrate with airplanes or even with fish and what we have with human beings. Right? There is lift. It is basically explained by Newtonian laws, and we have some input, but there are varieties of ways that we generate lift, not all exclusively as just described. If we start in the lower left, you'll see the hand moving through the water, thumb surface and little finger surface closer to the right side of the screen. and you can see both angle of attack, and you can see where the force lines are coming off the arm and how that affects it. And then you'll see a slight change of attack, angle of attack to 45 degrees, and what happens next. And a little bit of an analysis of the shape of that hand and arm through the water on the top. And certainly the boundary layer does separate on the back of the hand and the arm, where you'll see the yellow lines, and we wind up with a significantly changed way that we generate lift force. Again, practical application to coaching on deck, probably very little, but a good thing to basically understand. In a study by Bob Schleihoff back in the 1970s, different Olympians have a 30-degree range of pitch and hand at the same point in the stroke. So there is no one perfect pitch that's going to work for everybody. There's no one number of hand pitch that we need. Fact is, it's going to relate to limb speed, limb size, limb proportions relative to other proportions, amount of muscle being applied, all kinds of things. And the point here is don't get locked into one number of the way the hand should pitch. It's going to be different by different athletes. Schleihoff's study in the 70s is reproduced by graduate students over and over and over throughout history as they find that particularly interesting and make sure that things haven't changed since then. And the point is, they haven't. One of our other great scientists, Ernie McGlisco, put out a marvelous book early in his career called Swimming Faster, which he then later on says, please don't buy that book because that book is no longer correct. And those of us who have historical copies are lucky because there's lots of great stuff in there. But Ernie believes that the biomechanics material that he has is best represented in Swimming Fastest, his newer book, which is a very large book, and some of us jokingly refer to as the doorstop because it must weigh 10 pounds. It's not something you're going to be carrying around very often with you to too many places to read or too much airplane reading. It's a huge book, very detailed, very, very good. Ernie basically, one of the things that changed was that he used to teach sculling in diagonal patterns across the body. He believes that when you do that right now, you actually get deceleration, and that any change of direction in the hand leads to a loss of acceleration. So he likes to see one direction maintained throughout the stroke. And we'll talk about that very specifically when we get to each of the specific strokes about where that hand should be moving. So the complex motions of the past that were taught from Councilman with his S-curves on, in many scientists' minds today, not just Dr. McGlisco, really are a cause for deceleration. And what we're trying to do is make the hand movements and the arm movements as simple as possible and as direct as possible from front to back, beginning of the stroke to exit from the water. Resultant force is simply what happens when we have both lift and drag operating, as we do in most scenarios. We're going to see lift very clearly on the in-sweep of the stroke. We're going to see drag very easily at the finish of the arm pull and freestyle. And you're going to see lift and drag in almost every stroke, in almost every elite swimmer around the world, and different combinations or percentages contributing to the forward motion of the athlete. Your practical coaching and mine on the deck of the pool probably doesn't mean that we have to know exactly what percentages are going to contribute to each athlete's progress down the pool. We want to know that lift and drag combine and creates a resultant force that moves the swimmer forward. This next slide has some more examples graphed and charted of resultant force, and we need to recognize that both contribute to forward propulsion, accepting both. And if your swimmer is someone who is struggling with a stroke or they've recently stopped improving, it is worth tinkering with angle of attack changes. It is worth tinkering with pull patterns. It's worth tinkering with the width of the arm pull. But when things are going well, know enough to leave it alone. And then change it when there's a reason to change, not necessarily change just for the sake of change. Copying any particular athlete because they happen to be the elite athlete with the most successful pattern of the day is a good way to really confuse a lot of people and really not help your athlete very much at all. Don't be copying, folks. Follow good principles. Know what the best people are doing. Think about it. make changes when changes are necessary, not just for change alone. A little bit of practical tips in terms of studying lift and drag and understanding propulsion. Lift is primarily generated in movements that look like sculling, hands moving across the water. And there are many spots in all the stroke cycles where sculling should be emphasized. The breaststroke, obviously, is one of them, but there's spots in every stroke, including butterfly. Drag is generally generated by movements that push water back, or appears to move the hands, as we say, anchor, and the body goes past the hands, so it looks like we're pushing water in a backward direction. And again, many places in our strokes where that looks to be the case. But always remember that what we are truly doing is anchoring our hands in the water effectively and then pulling our body past our hands. Otherwise, we would never go forward. As we said, lift is seen on the inside, on the freestyle, and the finish of the arm pull. Both are important things. Practical coaching says know that both things exist, but don't necessarily try to emphasize one or the other. Try and figure out how that athlete is going forward effectively through the water, and recognize that an age group athlete is probably going to change their stroke multiple times throughout their career as their body changes. If they didn't change as their body changed, that probably would be a fairly serious coaching mistake. If we were to pick one single thing that has changed over the last 10 years, it looks like lift is becoming less and less significant in the world-class strokes, or less popular. And it looks a little bit like more strokes are drag dominated at the top velocities. Now, again, when I say top velocities for whom? Well, if you look at world-class athletes today, their strokes tend to be more drag dominated than lift dominated. But if we look at age group swimmers, many of them are still using lift principles to move down the pool. So now we have some tough coaching conundrums about whether we're teaching the stroke that's going to be effective for them at 17 or the stroke that's effective for them today. And today may mean that they've got a little tiny body of 75 pounds of skinny proportions, and at 17 they're going to have a grown man or a grown woman's body, and things are going to be significantly different. So maybe less lift propulsion in elite swimmers today, and more drag propulsion. And certainly as we go through time, we should always keep an eye on that, but recognize that that's going to change as athletes age. There are a couple of additional concepts that are pretty important in biomechanics, foundational principles. Two great Hall of Fame coaches who were not working together came up with one of the same concepts at the same time, and used it to improve the strokes of two very famous swimmers. One was Bud McAllister, the other was Nort Thornton, and the question at the bottom of the page was, how good is your swimming history? Do you remember who their athletes were? Janet Evans was coached by Bud McAllister, and Matt Biondi coached by Nort Thornton. The concept they were working with was a critical one, or is a critical one today, and that is the role of hip rotation. This, of course, is a 13-year-old version of Michelle Wie, and as you move through the sequence of pictures, you can see that her hips are constantly shifting and changing, and that she is using hip rotation to drive the power of her stroke. Well, in every single sport, in every single activity where there's an implement, or in our case a hand, that's going to be moving, that hip rotation is where the power comes from. And you can see as she addresses the ball and then she brings the club up on the backswing, by the third photograph or the middle photograph of the top row, you can see that her left hip is now significantly shifted, and her right hip is shifted back, and now she starts to drive the club head down, and as she drives the club head down, the right hip is ahead of the club head, and as she contacts the ball, between the second and third picture on the bottom row, you can see that that right hip is turned all the way over, and as she follows through, the right hip is now leading down the course. So it's a full hip rotation, similar motions in every other sport that we can think of where we're trying to generate power at the other end of the body.